Every channel covering this story is holding the same piece of evidence and pointing it in completely the wrong direction. For 3 months, creator after creator has opened with the same screenshot, an Instagram story posted unedited to millions of followers by a member of the royal household. And every single one of them stops right there. They treat that one screenshot as if it's the entire case. It barely qualifies as an introduction. While everyone else was stuck on a year-old Instagram post, Meghan Markle walked into a UN health summit in Geneva and told a global audience that adults have catastrophically failed an entire generation of children in the digital age. 3 weeks later, her own spokesperson was on the phone with a journalist defending the exact behavior she had just publicly condemned. Let that sink in for a moment. She spent that speech sounding the alarm about children and screen exposure. Then, barely 3 weeks later, her own team was fielding calls, explaining her children and screen exposure. No one connected those two moments. We're about to. And here's what should genuinely concern her inner circle. During the very same period all of this was unfolding, a biographer with a 40-year track record, one who has never lost a defamation case, released a new book on this marriage. Almost no one covering this story has read past the press release. We have. So here's exactly what you're getting. You'll find out what's buried in the pages no one is quoting. You'll hear her own father, on camera, directly contradicting one of her most repeated personal stories. And stay with us until the 11-minute mark, because there's a piece of footage over 30 years old, sitting in a television archive, that reframes everything she has said since. This is not a story about a title. It's a story about whether anything she has told the public, going all the way back to age 11, holds up when measured against documented evidence. Let's address the obvious question first. Biographers have been writing about this marriage for 6 years. Why does this particular book carry more weight than everything that came before it? 2 reasons, and neither one is hype. Reason 1, track record. Tom Bauer has spent 4 decades writing unauthorized biographies of individuals who could afford the most powerful defamation lawyers money can buy. Maxwell, Al-Fayed, Branson, Boris Johnson. Several of them took legal action against him. Maxwell pursued a personal lawsuit and then quietly allowed it to collapse, rather than risk what a full trial might expose. That is not gossip. That is a man whose work has already survived the legal gauntlet, repeatedly, and kept standing. Reason 2, the response. When this book began to be serialized, the Sussex camp didn't ignore it. They came out swinging, publicly labeling it, in their own words, deranged conspiracy theories. Strategic move? Arguably not. There is a rule in crisis communication older than the monarchy itself. Do not give something more oxygen than it already has. The moment you call something a conspiracy theory out loud, you have just directed 10 million people toward a theory worth investigating. Now let's talk about what's actually at stake. And I want to be precise here, because everyone before us has been dangerously loose with the word legal. There is no lawsuit. No one has been charged with anything. What we actually have is a courtesy title, granted by royal decree, sitting on top of a multi-million-dollar personal brand. And there is exactly one person on this planet with the constitutional authority to remove it. We'll get to who that is, and why a royal law expert says the rulebook on this question is far less clear-cut than the palace would like you to believe. That is the real crisis here. Not a courtroom, a signature. Every personal brand needs an origin story. Hers is the 11-year-old girl who wrote a letter and single-handedly forced a major corporation to pull a sexist dish soap advertisement. She has told this story at the United Nations, on her own podcast, and at a tour stop in Colombia just 2 years ago. Same story, every time, word for word. Here's what the record actually shows. Real footage exists. A 1993 Nickelodeon news segment currently sitting in a broadcast archive. An 11-year-old Meghan, on camera, discussing the letter. That part is not disputed by anyone. Here's what is disputed, or at the very least, unverifiable. Researchers went looking for documented evidence that her individual letter was ever received or acted upon by Procter & Gamble. They found none. What they found instead was a broader letter-writing campaign, one her own father helped coordinate, using his personal industry contacts to get her in front of a camera in the first place. And here is the detail that should give you pause. Her own father is on record, in his own documentary, stating that he believes she was part of a group effort, not a solo crusade. He goes further, suggesting that the lone hero version of the story may have been, in his words, a little embellished. That is not a tabloid source. That is not an anonymous insider. That is the man who raised her, speaking on camera. That is a genuine discrepancy. But it is not the most significant one. The most significant one is not about a story she told once at a speaking engagement. It is about a formal agreement she put her signature on. January 2020, the Sandringham Summit. The terms were made public and remain posted on the royal family's official website to this day. The Sussexes agreed, formally, not to use the style Her Royal Highness, not publicly, not commercially, not under any circumstances. Now track what followed. Last April, she reposted a letter on Instagram, unedited, with the opening line, Your Royal Highness. On her own Netflix production, when a friend refers to her as Meghan Markle on camera, she corrects her. She's Sussex now. And this year, an unconfirmed but widely reported claim surfaced suggesting the title appeared again, this time in private business correspondence. I'll flag that last point myself, because almost no one else covering this story will. It is unconfirmed. The outlet that reported it acknowledged as much. Do not allow anyone to sell you that detail as settled fact. But here is what matters. The case does not need it. The Instagram repost and the Netflix correction are both on camera, both undeniable, and both more than sufficient to raise a single, pointed question. What was that 2020 agreement actually worth? This is where nearly every channel covering this story has been either careless or deliberately misleading. Verify this yourself. Once you see it, you will notice it everywhere in this space. The Spotify deal. Every video packaging this into 2026's narrative wants you to feel as though 3 major deals collapsed within the same 6-month window. They didn't. Spotify ended in 2023, 3 years ago. The label's own executive went on record afterward, describing it as a predatory arrangement, noting that the partnership delivered exactly 1 season of content from a multi-year commitment. That is not breaking news. That is old news repackaged with a current timestamp. The Netflix story is real, but it has been oversimplified. This year, Netflix ended its partnership with her lifestyle brand specifically, and allowed the broader content deal to lapse without renewal. One insider reportedly summarized the internal sentiment in 3 words. We're done. True. What almost no one mentions is that a separate, smaller deal still exists on paper. This is a significant downgrade, not a clean break. And the Penguin Random House situation that everyone is calling a termination? There is no termination letter on record. What exists is a source telling a journalist that the company has internally moved on after declining 2 pitched projects. That is the real story, and it is categorically not the same thing as a contract being formally dissolved. That distinction matters enormously if you're assembling a legal argument rather than constructing a headline. If that picture already seems complicated, wait until we address the legal implications. Because once these timelines are properly laid out, the pattern underneath them is actually more troubling than the inflated version, not less. This is where every other outlet got it wrong, through sheer laziness. They all cite this biography as their definitive source. Not one of them tells you what is actually printed inside it. According to the book, A Confrontation Inside Kensington Palace in 2018, shortly after the wedding, Meghan reportedly telling Prince William to remove his finger from her face while Harry stood by and said nothing. According to the same text, Queen Camilla, in her own private words, suggesting that Meghan had brainwashed Harry. A royal biographer is putting language like that into print about the future king's wife, and no one is reading it closely enough to react. I want to be precise about what this material is. These are claims contained within an unauthorized biography. They are not court findings. They are not sworn confessions. The author has a documented history of surviving legal challenges to his reporting, but survived a legal challenge and proven factually true, are not the same sentence. Keep those two things separate. You are the one weighing the evidence here, not the commentator. What is not in dispute is the reaction it provoked. The Sussex camp called it a conspiracy theory. The author has spent 40 years being labeled exactly that, by subjects of exactly this caliber, and his publisher has never stopped printing. If you want to understand what people who actually worked alongside this couple are prepared to say on the record, look at Sophie Chandauka. She ran Harry's own charity, Sentabale. She went public, fully, by name, accusing him of bullying and harassment following a dispute over the organization's strategic direction. According to the same biography, she told Harry directly that major American donors no longer wanted any association with his Netflix output, and particularly not with Meghan's involvement. Internally, staff had reportedly begun referring to one of Harry's flagship charity events as the Meghan Games, citing what they viewed as a self-promotional media strategy that was actively drowning out the wounded veterans the event was originally built to serve. A colleague said that to his face, not anonymously, not through an intermediary. On the record, with her full name attached. I want to slow down here, because it's easy to reduce all of this to a running scoreboard. Deals lost, titles disputed, books published, and completely miss the human being who actually said this out loud, and then had to live with having said it. Sophie Chandauka did not seek to become a news story. She took leadership of a children's charity built to fight HIV and AIDS in two of the world's poorest countries. She inherited an organization with Harry's name above the door, and Harry's expectations embedded in every decision she was required to make. When she attempted to guide that organization in a direction its founders opposed, what she received in return, by her own account, was not dialogue. It was conflict. Serious enough that she placed the word bullying on the public record, under her own name. Consider what that genuinely costs a person. She carries no royal title as protection. She holds no streaming deal as a financial cushion. She is a charity executive who said something true and uncomfortable about two of the most recognizable people on the planet, fully aware of what that invites. And according to the reporting, what came back from inside the operation was not introspection. It was a message delivered directly to Harry, that the brand itself, and Meghan's presence within it specifically, had become something major American donors were deliberately navigating around. Read that again, not a tabloid making the claim, a donor-facing executive saying it to the founder's face about his own wife, while fighting to preserve a cause dedicated to children who will never know any of these names exist. That is the detail that deserves more of your attention than any Instagram screenshot ever produced. Now let's talk about what all of this is actually worth, in financial terms and in legal terms, because those are two entirely separate ledgers, and conflating them is precisely how this entire genre keeps misleading its audience. The finances first. The original Netflix deal, approximately $100 million. The Penguin Random House book deal, roughly $40 million across both principals. Harry's memoir advance alone, $20 million. Spotify, a multi-year arrangement that produced exactly one season of content before dissolving 3 years ago, with an executive publicly characterizing it as fraudulent on the way out. Sentabale, a charity that lost an estimated 23% of its funding when a primary sponsor withdrew. That is the financial picture. Now the law. Attorneys have a specific phrase for the gap between what someone commits to in writing and what they actually deliver. Material misrepresentation. You will hear that term used constantly in commentary surrounding this story. I'll tell you plainly, because every credible legal voice will say precisely the same thing. No one has filed that claim. There is no active case. Stating otherwise would simply be false, and I am not going to do that. What is real, and arguably more consequential to her long-term standing than any lawsuit, is considerably more straightforward. A royal law commentator, a former government minister who has formally studied this question, has stated publicly that while the legal framework is not fully settled, the monarch likely retains the authority to formally revoke a courtesy title, precisely because it was granted by royal prerogative in the first place. No trial required, no jury impaneled. Just a signature from whoever occupies the throne when institutional patience reaches its limit. That is the real consequence. Not a courtroom confrontation. A pen resting in a palace, waiting. So here is where this actually lands. Strip away the screenshots, the press statements, the recycled headlines. And what remains is not a series of isolated incidents. It is a pattern. A childhood story her own father says was embellished. A formal agreement she signed, and then quietly tested, on camera, more than once. A timeline of commercial decline, that her defenders want you to believe is sudden and recent, when significant portions of it are 3 years old. A biography filled with specific, named source allegations that virtually no one covering this story has actually opened and read. And a colleague, not a tabloid, a colleague, willing to put her full name on the public record, stating that the brand itself had become something institutional donors were actively choosing to avoid. None of that constitutes a courtroom verdict. It doesn't need to, because when the simplest story she ever told the world about herself, a letter to a dish soap company, written at age 11, cannot survive contact with her own father's recollection on camera, you have to ask a serious question. What happens to the harder stories? The ones that carry real weight, real money, and real consequences. So here is what I genuinely want to know. Drop your answer in the comments below. If the very first story she ever told the public about herself didn't hold up when her own father corrected it on camera, what do you think happens to the version of this marriage the world is currently being sold the moment someone with the actual documents decides to open the file? Leave your theory below.